Welcome back, amigos, to The Mark of Zorro, Part 6 by Johnston McCulley. 1 hour after Don Carlos Pulido and his ladies had been incarcerated in the carcel, Don Diego Vega, dressed most fastidiously, made his way slowly on foot up the slope to the Presidio to make his call on His Excellency the Governor. He walked with a swinging stride and gazing both to the left and the right as if at the hills in the distance, and once he stopped to observe a blossom that bloomed beside the path. His rapier was at his side, his most fashionable one with its jeweled hilt, and in his right hand he carried a handkerchief of flimsy lace, which he wafted this way and that like a dandy, and now and then he touched it to the tip of his nose. He bowed ceremoniously to 2 or 3 caballeros who passed him, but spoke to none beyond the necessary words of greeting, and they did not seek conversation with him. For, remembering that they had thought Don Diego Vega was courting the daughter of Don Carlos, they wondered how he would take this matter of her imprisonment along with her father and mother. They did not care to discuss the matter, for their own feelings were high, and they feared they might be betrayed into utterances that might be termed treasonable. Don Diego came to the front door of the Presidio, and the sergeant in charge called the soldiers to attention, giving Vega the salute due to his station in life. Don Diego answered it with a wave of his hand and a smile, and went on to the commandante's office, where the governor was receiving such caballeros as cared to call and express their loyalty. He greeted His Excellency with carefully chosen words, bowed over his hand, and then took the chair the governor was kind enough to indicate. "Don Diego Vega," the governor said, "I'm doubly glad that you have called upon me today, for in these times a man who holds high office would know his friends." "I should have called sooner, but I was away from my house at the time you arrived," Don Diego said. "You contemplate remaining long in Reina de los Angeles, Excellency?" "Until this highwayman known as Zorro is either slain or taken," the governor said. "By the saints, am I never to hear of the last of that rogue?" Don Diego cried. "I've heard of nothing else for these many days. I go to spend an evening with the fray, and in comes a crowd of soldiers chasing the Senor Zorro. I repair to the hacienda of my father to get me peace and quiet, and along comes a crowd of caballeros seeking news of Senor Zorro. These be turbulent times. A man whose nature inclines him to music and the poets has no right to exist in this present age." "It desolates me that you have been annoyed," the governor said, laughing, "but I hope to have the fellow soon, and so put an end to that particular annoyance. Captain Ramon has sent for his big sergeant and his troopers to return. I brought an escort of 20, and so we have ample men to run down this curse of Capistrano and when he makes his next appearance. Let us hope it will end as it should," said Don Diego. "A man in high office has many things with which to contend," the governor went on. "Look at what I was forced to do this day. I am called upon to put in prison a man of good blood and his lady wife and tender daughter, but the state must be protected." "I suppose you mean Don Carlos Pulido and his family?" "I do, caballero." "Now that it's called to my mind again, I must say a few words regarding that," Don Diego said. "I'm not sure that my honor is not involved." "Why, caballero, how can that be?" "My father has ordered that I get me a wife and set up my establishment properly. Some days ago I requested of Don Carlos Pulido permission to pay my address to his daughter." "Ah, I understand, but you are not betrothed of the young lady?" "Not yet, Excellency." "Then your honor is not involved, Don Diego, that I can see." "But I've been praying to court her." You may think the saints that it has gone no further, Don Diego. Think how it would look if you were allied with this family now. As for getting you a wife, come north with me to San Francisco de Asís, caballero, where the senoritas are far more lovely than here in your Southland. Look over those of good blood and let me know your preference, and I guarantee you the lady will listen to your suit and accept your hand in name. And I guarantee also that she'll be of a loyal family with which it will be no shame to make a contract. We shall get you a wife of a proper sort, caballero. If you'll pardon me, is it not taking stern measures to have Don Carlos and his ladies thrown into the carcel? Don Diego asked, flicking dust from his sleeve. I find it necessary, senor. Do you think it'll add to your popularity, Excellency? Whether it does or not, the state must be served. Men of good blood hate to see such a thing, and there may be murmurings, Don Diego warned. I should hate to see your Excellency make a wrong step at this juncture. What would you have me do? The governor asked. Place Don Carlos and the ladies under arrest, if you will, but do not incarcerate them. It is unnecessary. They will not run away. Bring them to trial as gentlefolk should be brought to trial. You are bold, caballero. By the saints, am I talking too much? It were better to leave these matters to a few of us who are trusted with attention to them, the governor said. I can understand, of course, how it irks a man of good blood to see a Don thrown into the carcel, and to see his ladies treated likewise, but in such a case as this— I have not heard the nature of the case, Don Diego said. Perhaps you may change your mind when you learn it. You have been speaking of this, Senor Zorro. What if I tell you the highwayman has been shielded and protected and fed by Don Carlos Pulido? That is astonishing. And that Donna Catalina is a party to the treason, and the lovely senorita has been fit to talk treasonably and dip her pretty hands into a conspiracy against the state. This is past belief, Don Diego cried. Some nights ago, Senor Zorro was at the Pulido hacienda. Warning was fetched the comandante by a native who is loyal. Don Carlos aided the bandit in tricking the soldiers, hid him in a closet. And when Captain Ramon was there alone, the highwayman stepped from the closet and attacked him treacherously and wounded him. By the saints! And while you were gone and the Pulidos were your house guests, Senor Zorro was in your house speaking to the senorita when the comandante walked up upon them, and the senorita grasped Captain Ramon by the arm and annoyed him until the Senor Zorro had made good his escape. It is past comprehension, Don Diego exclaimed. Captain Ramon has placed before me 100 such items of suspicion. Can you wonder now that I had placed them in the carcel? Did I merely have them put under arrest? The Senor Zorro would combine forces with them and aid to escape. And your intentions, Excellency? I shall keep them in the carcel while my troopers run down this highwayman. I shall force him to confess and implicate them, and then they shall have a trial. These turbulent times, Don Diego complained. As a loyal man, and I hope an admirer of mine, you should hope to see foes of the state confounded. Oh, I do, I most certainly do. All real foes of the state should receive punishment. I'm joyed to hear you say that, caballero, the governor cried, and he reached across the table and grasped Don Diego fervently by the hand. There was some more talk that amounted to nothing, and then Don Diego took his leave, for there were other men waiting to see the governor. After he'd left the office, the governor looked across at Captain Ramon and smiled. You're right, Commandante, he said. Such a man could not be a traitor. It would tire him too much to think treasonable thoughts. What a man! He must be enough to drive that old fire-eater of a father of his insane. Don Diego made his way slowly down the hill, greeting those he passed, and stopped again to regard the little flowers that blossomed by the wayside. At the corner of the plaza, he met a young caballero who was glad to call him friend, one of the small band of men who had spent the night at Don Alejandro's hacienda. "Ha, Don Diego, a fair day to you," he cried. And then he lowered his voice and stepped nearer. "Has, by any chance, the man we call leader of our League of Avengers sent you a message this day?" "By the bright blue sky, no," Don Diego said. "Why should the man? This Pulido business, it seems an outrage. Some of us have been wondering whether our leader does not intend to take a hand in it. We have been anticipating a message." "By the saints, oh, I trust not," Don Diego said. "I could not endure an adventure of any sort tonight. My head aches, and I fear I'm going to have a fever. I shall have to see the apothecary now about it. There are shiverings up and down my spine also. Is it not that a symptom? During the siesta hour I was bothered with pain in my left leg just above the knee. It must be the weather." "Let us hope that it will not result seriously," laughed his friend, and hurried across the plaza. An hour after dusk that night, a native sought out one of the caballeros with the intelligence that a gentleman wished to speak to him immediately, and this gentleman was evidently wealthy, since he had given the native a coin for carrying the message, when he might just as well have given nothing more than a cuff alongside the head. Also, the mysterious gentleman would be waiting along the path that ran toward the San Gabriel trail. And to be sure the caballero would come, he had bade the native say that there was a fox in the neighborhood. A fox. Zorro, the fox. The caballero thought he ruined the native forever by giving him another coin. He went to the rendezvous immediately, and there he found Senor Zorro sitting on his big horse, his face masked, the cloak wrapped around his body. "You'll pass the word, caballero," Senor Zorro said. "I would have all men who are loyal and wish to do so meet at midnight in the little valley beyond the hill. You know the place? Si, I shall be waiting." Then Senor Zorro wheeled his horse and dashed away in the darkness, and the caballero went back to the pueblo and passed the word to those men he knew could be depended upon, and urged upon them that they pass it to the others of the League. One went to Don Diego's house, but was told by the dispensero that Don Diego had complained of a fever and had retired to his chamber, and had left word that he would flay alive any servant who dared enter the room unless he was called. Near the hour of midnight, the caballeros began slipping from the pueblo one at a time, each upon the back of his best horse, and each armed with a sword and pistol. Each man had a mask that could be put over his features instantly, for that had been decided upon at Don Alejandro's hacienda, among other things. The pueblo was in darkness, save that there were lights in the tavern where some of His Excellency's escort made merry with the local troopers. For Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had returned with his men just before nightfall, glad to be back from the fruitless chase, and hoping the next scent would be warm. Those in the tavern had gone down the hill from the Presidio, some leaving their horses there without saddles or bridles on, and they had no thought of an encounter with Senor Zorro this night. The fat landlord was kept busy, for his soldiers from the north had coins in their purses and were willing to spend them. Sergeant Gonzalez, holding the attention of the company as usual, was detailing at length what he would do to this Senor Zorro if the saints were kind enough to let them meet and grant him a blade in his hand. There were lights in the big lounging room of the Presidio, too, for few soldiers had retired. And there were lights in the house where His Excellency was a guest, but the remainder of the pueblo was in darkness, and the people slept. In the carcel there was no light at all, except one candle burning in the office, where a sleepy man was on guard. The jailer was in his bed. Prisoners moaned on the hard benches in the prison room. Don Carlos Pulido stood before a window looking up at the stairs, and his wife and daughter huddled on the bench beside him, unable to sleep in such surroundings. The caballeros found Senor Zorro waiting for them as he said he would be, but he remained aloof, speaking scarcely a word until all were present. "Are all here?" he asked then. "All except Don Diego Vega," one replied. "He is ill with a fever, senor." And the caballeros chuckled, for they had an idea the fever was caused by cowardice. "I take it that you know something of what is in my mind," Senor Zorro said. "We know what has happened to Don Carlos Pulido and the ladies of his family. We know they are innocent of any treason, and were they not, they should not have been taken to a carcel and incarcerated with common felons and drunkards. Think of those gentle ladies in such surroundings. Think of it, because Don Carlos has the ill will of the governor. It is the sense of the league that something be done in this matter. If it is not, then I'll do something by myself." "Rescue them," a caballero said, and the others growled their approval. Here was a chance for risk and adventure, an opportunity to do a good deed. "We must enter the pueblo quietly," Senor Zorro said. "There is no moon, and we will not be observed if we use caution. We shall approach the carcel from the south. Each man will have a task to do. Some will surround the building to give notice if any approach it. Others must be ready to beat off the soldiers if they respond to any alarm. Others will effect an entrance to the carcel with me and rescue the prisoner." "It's an excellent plan," one said. "That is but a small part of it. Don Carlos is a proud man, and if given time for reflection, he may refuse to be rescued. We cannot allow that. Certain ones will seize him and take him from the place. Others will attend to Donna Catalina. I will undertake to the care for the señorita. Now, we have them free, and then what?" He heard murmurs, but no distinct reply, and so he continued to outline the plan. "All will ride to the highway just below this place," he said. "At that point we shall scatter. Those who have Donna Catalina in charge will hasten with her to the hacienda of Don Alejandro Vega, where she can be hidden if necessary, and where the governor's soldiers will hesitate before entering to seize her. Those who have Don Carlos in charge will take to the road to Pala, and at a certain point, some 10 miles from this pueblo, they will be met by 2 natives of understanding who will give them the sign of the fox. The natives will take Don Carlos in charge and care for him. When these things are done, each caballero will ride to his home quietly and alone, telling the story that pleases him and using great caution. I shall have conducted the señorita to a safe place by that time. She shall be given into the keeping of an old Fray Felipe, a man we can trust, and he will hide her if he must. Then we'll watch to see what the governor does." "What can he do?" a caballero asked. "Have them searched for, of course." "We must await developments," Senor Zorro said. Are all ready now?" They assured him that they were, and so named the men for each task, and they left the little valley and rode slowly and cautiously around the little town and approached it from the south. They heard the soldiers shouting and singing in the tavern, saw the lights of the presidio, and crept toward the carcel quietly, riding 2 by 2. In a short time it had been surrounded by quiet, determined men, and then Senor Zorro and 4 others dismounted and went to the door of the building. Senor Zorro knocked upon it with the hilt of his sword. They heard a man gasp inside, presently heard his steps on the stone flooring, and after a little time light showed through the cracks, and the aperture was open, and the sleepy face of the guard appeared. "What is wanted?" he asked. Senor Zorro thrust the muzzle of his pistol through the aperture and into the man's face in such a fashion that the little door could not be closed. "Open if you value your life. Open, and make not the slightest sound," Senor Zorro commanded. "What? What is this?" Senor Zorro is talking to you. By the saints, open, fool, or you die instantly. I'll open the door. Do not shoot, good Senor Zorro. I am only a poor guard and not a fighting man. I pray you do not shoot. Open quickly. As soon as I can fit the key to the lock, good Senor Zorro. They heard him rattling keys. Presently one was turned in the lock and the heavy door was thrown open. Senor Zorro and his 4 companions rushed inside and slammed and fastened the door again. The guard found the muzzle of a pistol pressed against his side of his head and would have knelt before these 5 masked and terrible men, only one of them caught him by the hair and held him up. Where sleeps the keeper of this infernal hole? Senor Zorro demanded. In yonder room, senor. And where have you put Don Carlos Pulido and his ladies? In the common prison room, senor. Senor Zorro motioned to the others, strode across the room, and threw open the door to the jailer's chamber. The man already sitting up in bed, having heard the sounds in the other room, and he blinked in fright when he beheld the highwayman by the light of the candle. Do not make a move, senor, Zorro warned. One screech and you're a dead man. Senor Zorro confronts you. May the saints preserve me. Where are the keys to the prison rooms? On that table, senor. Senor Zorro picked them up and then whirled upon the jailer again and rushed toward him. Lie down, he commanded, and on your face, scoundrel. Senor Zorro tore strips from the blanket and bound the jailer's hands and feet and made a gag, which he affixed. To escape death, he said then, it is necessary for you to remain exactly as you now, without making a sound for some time after we have left the carcel. I shall leave it to your own judgment to decide the length of time. Then he hurried back into the main office, beckoned the others, and led the way down the evil-smelling hall. Which door? He asked of the guard. The second one, senor. They hurried to it, and Senor Zorro unlocked and threw it open. He forced the guard to hold a candle high above his head. A gasp of pity came from beneath the highwayman's mask. He saw the aged Don standing by the window. He saw the 2 women crouched on the bench, saw the vile companions that they had in this miserable place. Now may heaven forgive the governor, he cried. Senorita Lolita looked up in alarm and then gave a glad cry. Don Carlos whirled at the highwayman's world. Senor Zorro, he gasped. The same, Don Carlos. I have come with some friends to rescue you. I cannot allow it, senor. I shall not run away from what is in store for me, and it would avail me little to have you do the rescuing. I am accused now of harboring you. I understand how it will look then if you effect my escape. There's no time for argument, Senor Zorro said. I'm not alone in this, but have 26 men with me and a man of your blood, and gentle ladies such as those of your family shall not spend an entire night in this miserable hole if we can prevent it. Caballeros, the last word was one of a command. 2 of the caballeros threw themselves upon Don Carlos, subdued him quickly, and half carried him into the hall, along it toward the office. 2 others grasped Donna Catalina by the arms, and gently as they could, and so carried her along. Senor Zorro bowed before the senorita and extended a hand, which she clasped gladly. You trust me, senorita? To love is to trust, senor. All things have been arranged. Ask no question, but do as I bid. Come. He threw an arm around her and so led her from the prison room, leaving the door open behind him. If some of the miserable wretches there could win through and out of the building, Senor Zorro had no wish to prevent them. More than half of them, he judged, were there because of prejudice or injustice. Don Carlos was causing an unearthly clamor, shouting that he refused to be rescued and that he would stay and face the governor at trial and show the blood that was in him. Donna Catalina was whimpering a bit because of fright, but made no resistance. They reached the office, and Senor Zorro ordered the guard to a corner of it, with instructions to remain there quietly for some time after they've gone, and Then one of the caballeros threw open the outside door. There was tumult outside at the moment. 2 soldiers had approached with a fellow caught stealing at the tavern, and the caballeros had stopped them. One glance at the masked faces had been enough to tell the troopers that something was wrong. A soldier fired a pistol, and a caballero answered the fire, neither hitting the mark, but the shooting was enough to attract the attention of those in the tavern and also the guards at the Presidio. Troopers at the Presidio were awakened immediately and took the places of the guards, while the latter mounted and spurred down the hill to ascertain the cause of this sudden tumult at that hour of night. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez and others hurried from the tavern. Senor Zorro and his companions found themselves facing a resistance when they least expected it. The jailer had gathered enough courage to work himself free of the gag and bonds, and he shrieked through a window of his chamber that prisoners were being rescued by Senor Zorro. His shriek was understood by Sergeant Gonzalez, who screeched for his men to follow him and earn a part of His Excellency's reward. But the caballeros had their 3 rescued prisoners on horseback, and they spurred through the gathering throng and so dashed across the plaza toward the highway. Shots flew about them, but no man was hit. Don Carlos Pulido was still screaming that he refused to be rescued. Donna Catalina had fainted, for which the caballero who had her in charge was grateful, since he could give more attention to his horse and his weapons. Senor Zorro rode wildly with the Senorita Lolita in the saddle before him. He spurred his magnificent horse ahead of all others, and so led the way to the high road. And when he had reached it, he pulled up his mount and watched the others come galloping to the spot to ascertain whether there had been any casualties. "Carry out your orders, caballeros," he commanded, when he saw that all had won through safely. And so the band had broken into 3 detachments. One rushed along the Pala road with Don Carlos, another took the highway that would lead them to the hacienda of Don Alejandro. Senor Zorro, riding without any of his comrades at his side, galloped toward Fray Felipe's place with Senorita's arms clasped tightly about his neck and the Senorita's voice in his ear. "I knew that you would come for me, Senor," she said. "I knew you were a true man and would not see me and my parents remain in that miserable place." Senor Zorro did not answer her with words, for it was not time for speech with his enemy so close on his heels, but his arm pressed the Senorita closer to him. He reached the crest of the first hill, and now he stopped the horse to listen for sounds of pursuit and to watch the flickering lights far behind. For there was a multitude of lights in the plaza now, and in all the houses, for the pueblo had been aroused. The Presidio building was ablaze with light, and he could hear a trumpet being blown. He knew that every available trooper would be sent on the chase. The sound of galloping horses came into his ears. The troopers knew in what direction the rescuers had traveled, and the pursuit would be swift and relentless, with His Excellency on the scene to offer fabulous rewards and urge on his men with promises of good posts and promotions. But one thing pleased Senor Zorro as his horse galloped down the dusty highway, and the Senorita clung to him, and the keen wind cut into his face. He knew that the pursuit would have to be divided into 3 parties. He pressed the Senorita to him again, put his spurs to the horse, and rode furiously through the night. Over the hills peeped the moon. Senor Zorro would have had the sky heavy with clouds this night and the moon obscured, could he have things go his way, but for now he was riding the upper trail and his pursuers were close behind. He could see him against the brightening sky. The horses ridden by the troopers were fresh, too, and most of those belonging to the men of His Excellency's escort were magnificent beasts, as swift as any in the country, and able to endure many miles of travel at a terrific pace. But now the highwaymen thought only of getting all the speed possible out of his own mount and making as great as he could the distance between himself and those who followed. For at the end of his journey he would need quite a little time, and if he was to accomplish what he set out to do. He bent low over the senorita and felt his horse with the reins, making himself almost a part of the animal as he rode, as any good horseman can. He reached the crest of another hill and glanced back before he began the descent into the valley. He could see the foremost of the pursuers. Had Senor Zorro been alone, no doubt the situation would have caused him no uneasiness, for many times he had been in a position more difficult and escaped. But the senorita was on the saddle before him now, and he wanted to get her to a place of safety, not only because she was the senorita and a woman he loved, but also he was not the sort of man to let a prisoner he rescued be recaptured. Such an event, he felt, would be a reflection on his skill and daring. Mile after mile he rode, the senorita clinging to him and neither speaking a word. Senor Zorro knew that he'd gained some on those who followed, but not enough to suit his purpose. Now he urged his horse to greater effort, and they flew along the dusty highway, past the haciendas where the hounds barked in sudden alarm, past the huts of natives where the clamor of beating hooves on the hard road caused bronze men and women to tumble from their bunks and rush to their doors. Once he charged through a flock of sheep that were being driven to Reina de los Angeles and the market there, and scattered them to either side of the road, leaving cursing herders behind him. The herders gathered their flock again just in time to have the pursuing soldiers scatter it once more. On and on he rode until he could see far ahead the mission buildings of San Gabriel glistening in the moonlight. He came to a fork in the road and took the trail that ran to the right toward the hacienda of Fray Felipe. Senor Zorro was a reader of men, and he was trusting to his judgment tonight. He had known that Senorita Lolita would have to be left either where there were women, else where there was robed Franciscan to stand guard over her. For Senor Zorro was determined to protect this lady's good name, and so he was pinning his faith on the old Fray Felipe. Now the horse was galloping over softer ground and was not making such good speed. Senor Zorro had little hope that the troopers would turn into San Gabriel Road when they arrived at the fork, as they might have done it not been moonlight, and had been able to catch sight now and then of a man being pursued. He was within a mile of Fray Felipe's hacienda now, and once more gave his horse the spurs in an effort to obtain greater speed. "I shall have scant time, senorita," he said, bending over her and speaking into her ear. "Everything may depend on whether I have been able to judge a man correctly. I ask only that you trust me." "You know I do, senor. And you must trust the man to whom I'm carrying you to, senorita, and listen well to his advice upon all matters concerned with this adventure. The man is a Fray." "Then everything will be well, senor," she replied, clinging to him closely. "If the saints be kind, we shall meet again soon, senorita. I shall count the hours and deem each one of them with age. I believe there are happier days ahead for us." "May heaven grant it," the girl breathed. "Where there is love, there may be hope, senorita." "Then my hope is great, senor." "And mine," he said. He turned his horse into Fray Felipe's driveway now and dashed toward the house. His intention was to stop only long enough to leave the girl, hoping that Fray Felipe would afford her protection, and then ride on, making considerable noise and drawing the troopers after him. He wanted them to think that he was merely taking a shortcut across Fray Felipe's land to the other road, and that he had not stopped at the house. He reined in his horse before the veranda steps, sprang to the ground, lifted the senorita from the saddle, hurrying with her to the door. He beat against it with his fist, praying that Fray Felipe was a light sleeper and easily aroused. From the far distance there came a low drumming sound that he knew was made from the hooves of the pursuers' horses. It seemed to Senor Zorro that it was an age before the old Fray threw open the door and stood framed in it, holding a candle in one hand, the highwayman stepped in swiftly and closed the door behind him, so no light would show outside. Fray Felipe had taken a step backward in astonishment when he had beheld the masked man and the senorita he escorted. "I am Senor Zorro, Fray," the highwayman said, speaking swiftly in low tones. "Perhaps you may feel that you owe me a small debt for certain things. For punishing those who oppressed and mistreated me, I owe you a large debt, caballero, though it is against my principles to countenance violence of any sort," Fray Felipe replied. "I was sure that I had made no mistake in reading your character," Senor Zorro went on. "The senorita is Lolita, the daughter of Don Carlos Pulido." "Ah! Don Carlos is a friend of the frailes, as you well know, and has known oppression and persecution the same as they. Today the governor to Reina de los Angeles had Don Carlos arrested and thrown into the carcel on a charge that has no true worth, as I happen to know. He also had the Donna Catalina and this young lady put into the carcel in the same prison room with drunkards and dissolute women. With the aid of some good friends, I rescued them. May the saints bless you, senor, for that kind action," Fray Felipe cried. "Troopers are pursuing us, Fray. It is not seemly, of course, that the senorita ride further with me alone. Do you take her and hide her, Fray, unless you fear that such course may cause you grave trouble?" "Senor," Fray Felipe thundered, "if the soldiers take her, they will put her in the carcel again, and probably she will be mistreated. Care for her then, protect her, and you'll more than discharge any obligation you feel that you owe me." "And you, senor?" "I shall ride on. The troopers may pursue me and not stop here at your house. I shall communicate with you later, Fray." "Is agreed between us?" "It is agreed," Fray Felipe replied solemnly, "and I would clasp you by the hand, senor." The handclasp was short, yet full of expression for all that. Senor Zorro then whirled toward the door. "Blow out your candle," he directed. "They must see no light when I open the door." In an instant, Fray Felipe had complied, and they were in the darkness. Senorita Lolita felt Senor Zorro's lips press against her own for an instant, and knew that he had raised the bottom of his mask to give her this. And then she felt one of Fray Felipe's strong arms around her. "Be of good courage, daughter," the Fray said. "Senor Zorro, it appears, has many lives as a cat, and something tells me that he was not born to be slain by troopers of his excellency." The highwayman laughed lightly at that, opened the door, and darted through, closed it softly behind him, and he was gone. Great eucalyptus trees shrouded the front of the house in the shadows, and in the midst of these shadows was Senor Zorro's horse. He noticed as he ran toward the beast that the soldiers were galloping down the driveway. They are much nearer than he expected to find them when he emerged from the house. He ran quickly toward his mount, tripped on a stone, and fell, frightened the animal so that it reared and darted half a dozen paces away and into the full moonlight. The foremost of his pursuers shouted when he saw the horse and dashed toward it. Senor Zorro picked himself up and gave a quick spring, caught the reins from the ground, and vaulted into the saddle. But they were upon him now, surrounding him, their blades flashing in the moonlight. He heard a raucous voice of Sergeant Gonzalez ordering the men. "Alive, if you can, soldier. His Excellency would see this rogue suffer for his crimes. At him, troopers, by the saints." Senor Zorro parried a stroke with difficulty and found himself unhorsed. On foot, he fought his way back into the shadows, and the troopers charged after him. With his back to the bole of a tree, Senor Zorro fought them off. 3 sprang from their saddles to rush at him. He darted from the tree to another, but could not reach his horse. But one belonging to a dismounted trooper was near him, and he vaulted into the saddle and dashed down the slope toward the barns and the corral. "After the rogue," he heard the Sergeant Gonzalez shouting. "His Excellency will have us flayed alive. This pretty highwayman escapes us now." They charged after him, eager to win promotion and reward, but Senor Zorro had some sort of a start on him, enough to enable him to play a trick. As he came into the shadow cast by the big barn, he slipped from the saddle, at the same time giving the horse road a cut with his rowels. The animal plunged ahead, snorting with pain and fright, running swiftly through the darkness toward the crowd below. The soldiers dashed in pursuit. Senor Zorro waited until they were past and then ran rapidly up the hill again, where he saw that some of the troopers had remained behind to guard the house, evidently with the intention of searching it later, and so found he could not reach his horse. Once more there rang out a peculiar cry, half shriek, half moan, with which Senor Zorro had startled those at the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. His horse raised its head, whinnied once in answer to his call, and then galloped toward him. Senor Zorro was in the saddle in an instant, spurring across the field directly in front of him. His horse went over a stone fence as if it had not been in the way, and after him speedily came a part of the troopers. They had discovered the trick he had used. They charged at him from both sides, met behind him, followed, and strained to cut down his lead. He could hear Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez shouting lustily for them to make the capture in the name of the governor. He hoped that he had drawn them all away from Fray Felipe's house, but he was not sure, and the thing that demanded his attention the most now was the matter of his own escape. He urged his horse cruelly, knowing that his journey across plowed ground was taking the animal's strength. He longed for hard trail on the broad highway. Finally he reached the latter. Now he turned his horse's head towards Reina de los Angeles, for he had work to do there. There was no senorita before him on the saddle now, and the horse felt the difference. Senor Zorro glanced behind, exulted to find that he's running away from the soldiers over the next hill, and he'd be able to elude them. But he'd been on guard, of course, for there might be troopers in front of him, too. His Excellency might have sent reinforcements to Sergeant Gonzalez, or might have been watching them from the tops of the hills. He glanced at the sky and saw that the moon was about to disappear behind a bank of clouds, and he'd have to make use of the short period of darkness, he knew. Down into the valley he rode and looked back to find his pursuers were only at the crest of the hill. Then came the darkness, and in proper time. Senor Zorro had lead of half a mile and on the pursuing soldiers now, but it was not his intention to allow them to chase him into the pueblo. He had friends in this locality. Besides, the highway was an old adobe hut where there lived a native Senor Zorro had saved from a beating. Now he dismounted before the hut and kicked against the door. The frightened native opened it. "I am pursued," Senor Zorro said. That appeared to be all that was necessary, for the native immediately threw the door of the hut wide open. Senor Zorro led his horse inside, almost filling the crude building, and the door was hastily shut again. Behind it, the highwayman and the native stood listening, the former with a pistol in one hand and his naked blade in the other. That the determined pursuit of Senor Zorro and his band of caballeros from the Carcel had been taken up so quickly was due to the Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez. Sergeant Gonzalez had heard the shots and had rushed from the tavern with the other troopers at his heels, glad of an excuse to escape without paying for the wine he had ordered. He had heard the shout of the jailer, and he understood it and immediately had grasped the situation. "Senor Zorro is rescuing the prisoners," he screeched. "The highwayman is in our midst again. To horse, troopers, and after him. There is a reward." They all knew about the reward, especially the members of the governor's bodyguard, who had heard His Excellency rave at the mention of the highwayman's name and declare he would make a captain of the trooper who captured him or brought him his carcass. They rushed for their horses, swung themselves into their saddles, and dashed across the plaza toward the Carcel with Sergeant Gonzalez at their head. They saw the masked caballeros galloping across the plaza, and Sergeant Gonzalez rubbed his eyes with the back of one hand and swore softly that he had taken too much wine. He had lied so often about Senor Zorro having a band of men at his back that here was the band materialized out of all of his falsehoods. When the caballeros split into 3 detachments, Sergeant Gonzalez and his troopers were so near them They observed the maneuver. Gonzalez quickly made 3 troops of the men who followed him and sent a troop after each band. He saw the leader of the caballeros turn toward San Gabriel and recognized the leap of the great horse the highwayman rode. He took after Senor Zorro with an exultant heart, being of mind to capture or slay the highwayman rather than to retake any of the rescued prisoners. For Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had not forgotten the time Senor Zorro had played with him in the tavern at Reina de los Angeles, nor had he given up the idea of taking vengeance for it. He had seen Senor Zorro's horse run before and wondered a bit now because the highwayman was not putting greater distance between himself and his pursuers, and the Sergeant Gonzalez guessed the reason, that Senor Zorro had Senorita Lolita Pulido on the saddle before him, and he was carrying her away. Gonzalez was in the lead, and now and then he turned his head and shouted orders of encouragement to his troopers. The miles flew beneath him, and Gonzalez was glad because he was keeping Senor Zorro in sight. To Fray Felipe's, that's where he's riding, Gonzalez told himself. I knew the old Fray was in league with that bandit. In some manner he tricked me when I sought this Senor Zorro at his hacienda before. Perhaps this highwayman has a clever hiding place there. Ha! By the saints, I shall not be tricked again. On they rode, and now catching glimpses off and on of the man they pursued, and always in the minds of Gonzalez and his troopers were thoughts of the reward and promotion if captured. Their horses were beginning to show some fatigue already, but they did not spare the animals. They saw Senor Zorro turn into the driveway that led to Fray Felipe's house, and Sergeant Gonzalez chuckled low down in his throat because he felt that he had guessed correctly. He had the highwayman now. If Senor Zorro continued to ride, he could be seen and followed because of the bright moonlight. If he stopped, Senor Zorro could not hope to cope successfully with half a score of troopers with Gonzalez at their lead. He dashed up to the front of the house and started to surround it. They saw Senor Zorro's horse, and then they saw the highwayman himself, and Gonzalez cursed because half a dozen troopers were between him and his prey, and were at him with their swords, threatening to end the business before Gonzalez could reach the scene. He tried to force his horse into the fight. He saw Senor Zorro spring into the saddle and dash away, and the troopers after him. Gonzalez, not being close, gave his attention to the other half of his duty. He bade some of his soldiers surround the house so that none could leave. Then he saw Senor Zorro take the stone fence and started in pursuit, all except the guards around the house joining him. But Sergeant Gonzalez went only as far as the crest of the first hill. He noticed how the highwayman's horse was running and realized that he could not be overtaken. Perhaps the sergeant could gain some glory if he returned to Fray Felipe's house and recaptured the senorita. The house was still being guarded when he dismounted before it, and his men reported that none had attempted to leave the building. He called 2 of his men to his side and knocked at the door. Almost instantly it was opened by Fray Felipe. "Are you just from bed, Fray?" Gonzalez asked. "Is it not time of night for honest men to be in bed?" Fray Felipe asked in turn. "It is, Fray. Yet we find you out of it. How does it happen that you have not come from the house before? Did we not make enough noise to awaken you? I heard sounds of combat. And you may hear more, Fray, else feel the sting of a whip again unless you answer questions swiftly and to the point. Do you deny that Senor Zorro has been here?" "I do not." "Ha! Now we have it. You admit it, then, that you're in league with this petty highwayman, that you shield him upon occasion. You admit that, Fray?" "I admit nothing of the sort," Fray Felipe replied. "I never set eyes on this Senor Zorro to my knowledge until very few minutes ago." "That is a likely story. Tell it to the stupid natives. But do not try to tell it to a wise trooper, Fray. What did this Senor Zorro wish?" "You were so close upon the man's heel, senor, that he scarce had time to wish for anything," Fray Felipe said. "Yet you had some speech with him?" I opened the door at his knock, senor, the same as I opened it at yours. What said he? The soldiers were pursuing him. And he asked that you hide him so he could escape capture at our hands? He did not. Wanted a fresh horse, did he? He did not say as much, senor. If such a thing is painted, undoubtedly he would merely have taken the horse without asking, had he wanted it. Ha! What business had he with you, then? It would be well for you to answer openly, Fray. Did I say he had business with me? By the saints. The saints are better off on your lips, senor, boaster and drunkard. Do you wish to receive another beating, Fray? I'm riding on His Excellency's business. Do not delay me any further. What said this pretty highwayman? Nothing that I'm at liberty to repeat to you, Senor Fray Felipe said. Sergeant Gonzalez pushed him aside roughly and entered the living room, and his 2 troopers followed at his heels. Light the candelero, Gonzalez commanded of his men. Take candles. If you can find any, we search the house. You search my poor house, Fray Felipe cried. And what do you expect to find? Fray Felipe asked. I expect to find a piece of merchandise this pretty Senor Zorro left here, Fray. What do you imagine he left? A package of clothing, I suppose, a bundle of loot, a bottle of wine, a saddle to be mended. What would a fellow leave, Fray? One thing impresses me. Senor Zorro's horse carried double when he arrived at your house and was carrying none but Senor Zorro when he departed. And you expect to find the other half of the horse's load, replied Gonzalez. Failing to find it, we may try a twist or 2 of your arm to see whether you can be made to speak. You would dare, you would so affront the Fray, you would descend to torture. Meal mush and goat's milk, quoth Sergeant Gonzalez. You fooled me once in some manner, but you will not so fool me again. Search the house, troopers, and be sure that you search it well. I shall remain in this room and keep this entertaining Fray company. I shall endeavor to discover what his sensations were while he was being whipped for swindling. Coward and a brute, Fray Felipe thundered. There may come a day when persecution shall cease. Meal mush and goat's milk. When this disorder shall end and honest men be given their just dues, Fray Felipe cried, when those who have founded a rich empire here shall receive the true fruits of their labor and daring instead of having them stolen by dishonest politicians and men who stand in their favor. Goat's milk and meal mush, Fray. When there shall be 1,000 Senor Zorros, and more if necessary, to ride up and down the El Camino Real and punish those who do wrong. Sometimes I would that I were not afraid that I might play such a game myself. We'd run you down in short order and stretch a rope with your weight, Sergeant Gonzalez told him. Did you help His Excellency's soldiers more? Perhaps His Excellency would treat you with more consideration. I give aid to no spawn of the devil, Fray Felipe said. Now you grow angry, and that is against your principles. It is not part of the robed Fray to receive what comes his way and give thanks for it, no matter how much it chokes him. Answer me that, angry one. You have about as much knowledge of a Franciscan's principles and duties as the horse you ride. I ride a wise horse, a noble animal. He comes when I call and gallops when I command. Do you not deride him until you ride him? An excellent jest. Imbecile. Meal, mush, and goat's milk, said Sergeant Gonzalez. The 2 troopers came back into the room. They had searched the house well. They reported invading every corner of it. No trace can be found of any other person other than Fray Felipe's native servants, all of whom were too terrified to utter falsehood and said they had seen nobody around the place who did not belong there. Hidden away well, no doubt, Gonzalez said. Fray, what is in the corner of that room? Bales of hides, Fray Felipe replied. I've been noticing it from time to time. The dealer from San Gabriel must have been right when he said the hides he purchased of you were not properly cured, and for those, I think you'll find them so. Then why did they move? Sergeant Gonzalez asked. 3 times I saw the corner of the bale move. Soldiers, search there. Fray Felipe sprang to his feet. Enough of this nonsense, he cried. You've searched and found nothing. Search the barns next and then go. At least let me be a master in my own house. You've disturbed my rest enough. You will take a solemn oath, Fray, that there is nothing alive behind those bales of hides? Fray Felipe hesitated, and Sergeant Gonzalez grinned. Not ready to forswear yourself, eh? The sergeant asked. I had thought you would hesitate at that, my robed Franciscan. Soldiers, search the bales. The 2 men started toward the corner, but they had not covered half the distance when Senorita Lolita Pulido stood up behind the bales of hides and faced them. Ha! Unearthed at last, Gonzalez cried. Here's the package Senor Zorro left in Fray's keeping. And pretty package it is. Back to the carcel she goes. And this escape will make her final sentence even greater. But there was Pulido blood in the senorita's veins, and Gonzalez had not taken that into account. Now the senorita stepped to the end of the pile of hides, so light from the candelero struck full upon her. One moment, senores, she said. One hand came from behind her back, and in it she held a long, keen knife, as sheepskinners use. She put the point of the knife against her breast and regarded them bravely. Senorita Lolita Pulido does not return to the foul carcel, now or at any time, senores. Rather, she would plunge this knife into her heart, and so die a woman of good blood should. If His Excellency wishes for a dead prisoner, he may have one. Sergeant Gonzalez uttered an exclamation of annoyance. He did not doubt the senorita would do as she had threatened, if the men had attempted to seize her. And while he might have ordered the attempt in the case of an ordinary prisoner, he did not feel sure that the governor would say they'd done the right if he ordered it now. After all, Senorita Pulido was the daughter of a Don, and her self-inflicted death might cause trouble for His Excellency. It might prove the spark to powder a magazine. Senorita, the person who takes his or own life risks eternal damnation, the sergeant said. Ask this Fray if it's not so. You're only under arrest, not convicted and sentenced. If you're innocent, no doubt you'll soon be set at liberty. It is no time for lying speeches, senor, the girl replied. I realize the circumstances only too well. I've said that I will not return to the carcel, and I mean it. And I mean it now. Take one step toward me, and I take my life. Senorita, Fray Felipe began. It is useless for you to attempt to prevent me, good Fray, she interrupted. I have pride left in me, thank the saints. His Excellency gets only my dead body if he gets me at all. Here's a pretty mess, Sergeant Gonzalez explained. I suppose there's nothing for us to do except retire and leave the senorita to her freedom. Ah, no, senor, she cried quickly. You're clever, but you're not clever enough by far. You would retire and continue to have your men surround the house. You would watch for an opportunity and then seize me. Gonzalez growled low in his throat, for that had been his intention, and the girl had read it. I shall be the one to leave, she said. Walk backward, stand against the wall, senores. Do it immediately, or I plunge this knife into my bosom. They could do nothing except obey. The soldiers looked to the sergeant for instructions, and the sergeant was afraid to risk the senorita's death, knowing it would call down upon his head the wrath of the governor, who would say that he had bungled. Perhaps, after all, it would be better to let the girl leave the house. She might be captured afterwards, for surely a girl could not escape the troopers. She watched them closely as she darted across the room to the door. The knife was still held at her breast. Fray Felipe, you wish to go with me? She asked. You may be punished if you remain. Yet I must remain, senorita. I could not run away. May the saints protect you. She faced Gonzalez and the soldiers once more. I'm going through this door, she said. You will remain in this room. There are troopers outside, of course, and they will try to stop me. I shall tell them that I have your permission to leave. If they call and ask you, you are to say it is so. And if I do not, then I use the knife, senor. She opened the door, turned her head for an instant, and glanced out. I trust your horse is an excellent one, senor, for I intend to use it, she told the sergeant. She darted suddenly through the door and slammed it shut behind her. After her, Gonzalez cried. I looked into her eyes. She will not use the knife. She fears it. He hurled himself across the room, the two soldiers with him, but Fray Felipe had been passive long enough. He went into action now. He did not stop to consider the consequences. He threw out one leg and tripped Sergeant Gonzalez. The two troopers crashed into him. They all went to the floor in a tangle. Fray Felipe had gained some time for her, and it would be enough, for the senorita had rushed to the horse and jumped into the saddle. She could ride like a native. Her tiny feet did not reach halfway to the sergeant's stirrups, but she thought nothing of that. She wheeled the horse's head, kicked at its side, and a trooper rushed around the corner of the house. Pistol ball whistled past her head. She bent lower over the horse's neck and rode. Now a cursing Sergeant Gonzalez was on the veranda, shouting for his men to get a horse and follow her. The tricky moon was behind a bank of clouds again, and they could not tell the direction the senorita was taking except listening for sounds of the horse's hooves, and they had to stop to do that. And if they stopped, they lost time and distance.